with maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure, sure. So my name is Becca Williams, and my work is emotional and trauma release. I support people in identifying and understanding their reactive patterns that trigger intense emotions and uncontrollable responses. And importantly, we look at the specific triggers that set them off. So, in other words, I guide people through a process to diminish and eventually replace these reactions with feelings and behaviors and attitudes that align with their highest intentions. Yeah. And so my method's unique in that it prepares people for often psychedelic sessions by grounding them in deep practical tools for emotional resilience and self inquiry and integration. But I also in order for that preparation, we use as a tool microdosing often, either cannabis or psilocybin. I work with the plant medicines.
Okay, cool. Well, I have had a class with you, which I got so much out of. So it's kind of exciting to have you giving this interview, and I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And I have some questions with you. So how about I ask you one of them?
Sure. And by the way, I'm honored to be here with you. You were in the, I call it graduate program, where it was a year long study of the emotions, and you were one of our star students.
Thank you, thank you. Well, speaking about that, part of those classes had to do with Kriyas, which I'm going to give my lay definition of that, but Kriyas seem to be, breath work combined with specific uh, body movements or positions held that help support that process. Can you maybe say a little bit more about what a Kriya is actually and not my definition? And then also like how they came into your life, why they were, of interest to you and what you've gotten out of them?
Absolutely. And you're right. Kriyas are a combination of practices that involve movement and postures and hand placements that we call mudras and sounds that we call mantras and some usually very active breath work. And so
Mhm.
these practices that hail from the Kriya and Kundalini traditions out of India, they're used to purify and balance and harmonize the body, mind, and spirit, the yoga, right? And then in my work, which is called emotional liberation, we match that to specific outcomes. And a very important aspect of this during the kriyas is my narrative prompting. So overall, kriyas are a part of the emotional liberation process. And importantly, though, we need the cognitive understanding of the emotions. You know, what does anxiety and shame and depression and anger and guilt and neediness and sadness, those are the seven that we study. What do they feel like? And that's very hard oftentimes because we got to stay with that emotion. And then we experience them through the Kriyas that are tailored to resonate with the emotion that's arising. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my experience is in doing it is that the Kriyas seem to stir energies up that I don't know, for me they're somewhat of a blank slate of energy, and then having you there, you have us call in difficult emotions of the seven that you talked about, and they come up like it opens that door, and before you know it you're actually sitting in fear or depression or sadness, and it's like a very specific way to kind of call them forth and work with them without even going into the story part of it, I guess. So that was always very surprising.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, very specific, and what I believe very safe, because that's why it's so hard for people to summon these emotions without this container, because they can, it can, we put different words to it, but it can be re-traumatizing. But this is what is most effective and efficient approach to it that I know. And what it does is it engages the mind to kind of, the mind wants to know, but we don't want to get the mind involved because we need to go into the intuitive. And so, how do we do that without the mind getting involved? Well, during these kriyas that are calling up counting or breath work or movements, keep the mind occupied while we go in.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's really a matter of art over science, if you will, because that's what, yogic science is really all about. So we have the science, the Western science, and the yogic science that are engaged in this way.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the things that I can't help make a comparison between is that they're they're brought on through breath work. They're brought on through like agency and capacity of the person doing them. And, if I'm kind of putting it into a Western model of trying to understand it, it allows you to stay in a window of tolerance so that if you do start to, feel overwhelmed, that it's fairly easy to come out of a breath work. It's fairly easy to come out of, a stance that you're holding and kind of re-regulate. So that's just, I think it's something, I don't know, that I found fascinating. And again, like everything old is like new again. So it's kind of like this has already been figured out to a large extent by people, and it blows my mind. So yeah.
Yeah, that's well said in that window of tolerance. So when we first start this, and when I bring students on in the first few weeks, it's the hardest time because they have this nervous system that is unconditioned, and the feelings when we start calling them up can be very close and can be overwhelming. So as you say, you can quit the breathing. So if we're in a position where we're doing something, what I tell people is if there's emotion that comes up and movement, and say, let's say we're sobbing or something like that, just maintain the posture, maintain the mudra, and just go into long deep breathing if you can, until you actually are able to stabilize yourself and then come back. And importantly, this is self therapy. I guide and show and teach people how to do it, but I expect them to continue on their own. And I'm always here. A therapist or coach can always be helpful if people need that. But this is really depending on oneself. And it is the beginning of self trust and self love and self compassion.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree. And I think one of the things that was coming to my mind is like as I learn more about like in the context of something like trauma, is that one of the or a lot of the thinking around how to help a person start to release and heal from their trauma is actually by titrating those traumatic feelings or energies in their system again and having them sit with it. That's actually, the release of it.
And it's a practice, that titration, that it's a practice. So the more you can condition your nervous system in order to bring up what you're feeling, then you're growing your awareness also to understand, what am I feeling and why am I feeling it? And that, like any practice, it takes time and effort put in. So anything you want to get good at, whether it's running or playing the violin or moving your emotions through to release and heal, takes practice.
And I am still practicing.
You know what? We'll all be practicing. I believe if we're committed, I know for myself, I will be practicing until the last breath on my deathbed.
You and me both. Well, so this kind of leads me to the question of, this was a practice that you had taken on. I know a little bit about you, so I know that you had, you know, been taught by your teacher, a lot of these practices, and then plant medicine came on your radar and was interest of you of like, how could you bring these two together? I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what led you to that, and maybe even a little bit of the story of how you went to your teacher and presented, hey, I think there's something to this, and maybe, uh, what his thinking was around it and where you arrived with it.
So I was in my late 50s when I discovered this work, but I had been using cannabis for years, since college, to calm crippling anxiety and a lot of other things. But the anxiety was what I woke up with and went to bed with, and my day was punctuated with it. And what I found with the cannabis, and back then it wasn't, it wasn't as strong as it is today. So you can just adjust yourself with the strength of it today. But back then it was like 17% THC as opposed to compared to 20, 25, nearly 30% THC. Anyway, I would smoke it, and I felt better. It relieved the anxiety symptoms, but it was palliative. And that means that when I was no longer under the influence, the anxiety came back. So it was palliative, but it was transitory. It was very short lived. And so uh, uh, and that's what I did. But then one thing led to another, and it's a longer story. But I was introduced to emotional liberation about 11 or 12 years ago, and I started out with a year-long program with a group of other people. And I was drawn to go deeper in the course of this work. And I suspected that a little cannabis might do that, which I did. It was just like microdosing cannabis, if you will. And I found in this cohort of about 12 people that I seemed to be processing the trauma faster. And so I went to my teacher at the time, Mayor Kulsa, and I told him about this. And he's the creator and the developer of emotional liberation, but he's also a Kundalini yoga instructor of 40 years. And his discipline cautioned against any substances. But he was very open minded to it because I didn't want to pull any punches. I wanted to let him know where I was and what I was doing. So he was very open minded about it, saying, you do it, but it's not within my framework. So I'm also trained as a clinical nutritionist. So I continued to share with him literature and reports and evidence-based case studies about it, to familiarize him with where I was coming from on that. And he never included it in his coursework, but he and I certainly found common ground where he accepts what I do. Yeah. And then, I went further after the cannabis and started introducing microdosing psilocybin. And, that's the act of consuming tiny amounts of psychedelics where the effects of the drug they're subtle, but they have an influence on some aspects of our cognition. And the feeling is still perceptible, but doesn't complicate concentration. So people can do it on a regular basis, as you well know. So I describe it as getting all the possible advantages of a full dose without the hallucinatory aspects, but in a softer and more controlled, sustainable way. And so what I found was, and this was from personal experience, and I always put myself out there. I would never ask my students and clients to do something that I haven't already experienced. But what I found, where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought now.
You were bringing in
Um,
psilocybin with the Kriyas.
Yeah, that this is so. What I found was that trauma, and this is speaking energetically of energetic medicine, where Western science doesn't really observe this, but it seemed that some of the trauma was so deep that when in this work, layers of it come off. We move through it, and release it or compost it, and then we heal. And it's wave after wave after wave of trauma. And you had said that it's lodged in the nervous system and the tissues, absolutely. But I think in an energetic way, it's lodged in the emotional body, the energetic body, and how you get that up. And I found that the psilocybin, the microdosing of psilocybin, really facilitates that, taking another big step in this work.
I feel like we're talking about something that's kind of like at the core of what this, interview is about and the capstone I'm doing. And I don't know that we're going to arrive at the answer, but I just find it really interesting is that there's something about lower dosage that is allowing enough presence of I'll just say like ego presence of just like personality to be present, that there's a continuity of the identity of the self through the experience, that you're not getting lost into like maybe taking too much of a substance, that you lose the narrative of what you're working with. And for me, just for myself, I remember that being a very important aspect of doing this work, was that I could track what was happening in my system through
Yes.
the entire experience. And and the Kriyas coming into it with, because I personally responded better to the psilocybin. I don't know, it's just like my medicine a little bit more than cannabis, but I still use cannabis. But point being is low dose with the Kriya would put me places on par with or even more stirring than large doses. Like that combination allows you to really have a much larger experience than just say the low dose by itself. And because you're bringing in this Kriya, it's something that you're doing. You can also come out of it very quickly. So yeah.
Absolutely. It's about control.
Mhm.
So the big difference is that you are always in control in this work. So if it becomes overwhelming, you can stop it and you can just move through it. I always recommend holding your posture, holding the mudra, going into long deep breathing. Don't just go and collapse, but you have the control over it. Whereas you allude to with macro journeys, you lay down, you take the macro journey, you put on a blindfold and you lay there and you let the medicine have its way with you. And a lot of people are not ready for that. And so, my stance on macro psychedelic journeys is evolving. And I'm now experimenting with people intending and preparing for a psychedelic journey. And I believe preparing them through a process of learning the principles of emotional liberation, being able to identify their difficult emotions and gaining the awareness to feel what they're feeling and why they're feeling it, and microdosing at the same time. So getting a handle on that, conditioning in the nervous system, creating expectations. So I'm, offering a 7-week course to introduce people to their difficult emotions, being able to be with them and process, practicing that, and then if they wish, then do a macro journey. And my hypothesis, and I'm in my early stages of this, working with students and clients, my hypothesis is that they will have a more productive experience in the macro journey, if they choose to do that, when they have a grasp of the emotional release process.
Yeah, me too, because I think there's something about that breath work combined with low dose that gives you the map. It gives you kind of the rules. It gives you a kind of operating system of like what that realm feels like and what it feels like to intentionally use that time in that space. Uh,
Mm.
and then when you scale that up to say a macro dose, um, yeah, you can actually bring your intention with more precision, or I don't know, with greater effect into that space, and work on things you want to work on, you know, and
Yes,
in this really
I agree.
paradoxical way, sometimes that might be learning to let go and let things work through you that need to be worked through. But it's like you use the analogy of learning to surf. You learn to surf emotions. You become a skilled surfer, if you will. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. We say surfing the waves of uncertainty with
Yeah.
grace
Yeah,
and perseverance.
there it is. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Let me see. I think we've covered quite a bit, but let me see. I think I'll just wrap up with maybe a quick question or two about why you like one medicine over another, or maybe not, you don't have to pick your favorite child, but just like if you have any ideas of what cannabis does for you or for others that you've noticed in these spaces versus psilocybin, and why one may or may not be better for another, or I don't know. This is just sort of speculative here as to what have you noticed? What do you like?
Well, all good points. My clinician's hat makes me bring up biochemical individuality. So what you are talking about is your particular preference and how you respond to these medicines. And so it's very specific, and that's why I like this self therapy, because people go, well, tell me what to do. Tell me what to do. And I hold the space for them, but I say, you need to choose what you want to do. And so in regard to cannabis, I love them both. I love both, both psilocybin and cannabis. They're earth medicines that resonate for me, and that's what I work with. And let's go back to cannabis. I believe for physical maladies, cannabis has come into its own, particularly in the United States. But for psycho-spiritual work, it's kind of a different animal. And I found that people are really hungry for that particular application. I taught a 7-week course on the Shift Network called The Power of Cannabis for Emotional Freedom. And we had about 90 people in that course, and they really, some of them, the spectrum was a total naivete, where I never have done anything with cannabis at all, to I have used it a lot for recreation or for my ache and back or whatever, but never for this psycho spiritual aspect. So that was really a fun application in that particular space. And I believe that cannabis works because it's a non-specific amplifier, and that's a term that's mostly used in psychedelic and consciousness research, to describe substances like psilocybin, like LSD, like mescaline, that they don't force a specific experience, but they rather amplify whatever's already in your mind, in your environment. And I think that's the same with cannabis. And I know that cannabis is a whole lot more accessible than psychedelics, and it's much more legal. So in
Yeah.
my work where we're consciously working with cannabis, in a psycho-spiritual way, and it can be transformational. But I agree with you. Your specificity, your choices, the way you lean. Another person who we talked to could be the exact opposite.
Mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective of just kind of putting that autonomy and like what's right for you, and that's also part of the journey is tuning into your system, noticing um, what is your relationship with this medicine versus that medicine, and listening to it is also a deep part of that learning.
For me, it's about my work. Emotional liberation is a container, and then we take the plant medicine, put it in. Yeah.
I like that. Well, I'm out of questions for today, but it's a really great conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I guess I would just try to close with asking, is there anything you want to add to that? Is there anything that you want to say that you haven't gotten to say? And I invite that.
Well, I'd like to invite people to my website if they want to know more about this work. And I also have some free practices that they can try. But my website's as easy as my name.org, beccawilliams.org. And they can go there to find out more about my work. And you know what? I really do want to comfort people and tell them that no matter how bad they feel, that they can feel better, that they can heal from whatever trauma is haunting them and tormenting them today. And it's not an overnight process, but it's one foot in front of the other because we need to strengthen and condition that nervous system. I have a jack nervous system, by the way,
No, you're like
because of this
Arnold
work.
Schwarzenegger of the nervous system.
But yeah, everybody can feel better. I really believe, and that's my message to the world, and that's how I go about my work.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.